Welcome to Tech Tuesday. Madison will be presenting on some cool GIS stuff today. She's sick, so please bear with her. Madison, if somebody's talking or has a question for you, you can throw candy at them.
Awesome. At them. Prepare yourself.
Right at our head.
Well, I don't have to stand up and be so lectury, but I figured we'd start and just say our names and where we're from, because we're talking about geography today, and I'll be pulling up some cool links and websites, so if I know where you guys are from, it'll be more applicable to go to those places. Well, we can look at some really cool Michigan data when we get there. So great. Well, I want to kind of keep it as like a dialogue. So what are your guys' experience with GIS in general? Varying from I have no idea what it is to I've dabbled in it a little bit.
Very little.
Okay, so good. So then I can actually go into what is a GIS, and I won't be re-explaining things. So obviously, since we're geographic, it's something that's geographically rooted in the world somewhere, and it kind of speaks to the different ways you can present data. So as opposed to looking at a population table, you can map that, root it geographically, and it really says a lot more than a table would say. I stands for information, which speaks about the table itself. GIS stores two types of information. We got features, which can be real-world features or human-made features, since I'll be talking about a lot of social data. Census tracts are particularly of interest to me, so those are delineated by people. But there's also natural streams, oceans, mountains. And then to go further, attributes are what describe these features. So you don't just have a mountain within that feature, within that little, maybe the mountain is represented as a triangle on a map. You could click on that triangle and you could see the height of the elevation of the mountain, if it was an active volcano or not, what kind of ground cover was over the mountain, all those different types of attributes that speak to that specific mountain. So you can really get more in depth than just drawing a triangle on a piece of paper and calling it a mountain. So that information really is what takes it further. And then even further is the S stands for system. So obviously it's a computer system, but it integrates a lot of things, graphics and tools that can analyze and you can essentially create and manipulate your own data with this. So if you had these are different layers in a map, and you had the locations of existing coffee shops, you had, this is census tract data, people aged 18 to 49, where the biggest concentrations of these people are, and then also the commercial zoning areas. So whatever the city is, you can group these all together and you can run some analysis to come up with, well, where would I want to put a new coffee shop? Probably in the place that has highest concentrations of young people, in a commercial zoning area and not near the existing coffee shops. So this really allows us to take any sort of information and manipulate it and make relationships between this data to come up with really new, intriguing ways to look at things and to analyze things. And we're allowed to take things a step further that way. So unfortunately, we don't have a geography department here at CC, but GIS is kind of that geography hub anyways, and it sort of allows us to access all staff and faculty and students in any manner of project. So as I'm going along, as I'm talking about these, if you have any ideas or any sort of thoughts about how you would apply GIS or whatever your specialty is, definitely speak up and we can get into that, because I mean, social research is my specialty, but I'll know less about other things, but we can still talk about it. So the purpose of this, though, is to be able to integrate spatial and social thinking so that we can identify those intersections, such as, who has access or no access to a certain resource. That could be money, that could be education, that could be food, that could be anything you consider a resource. You could look at unequal access across populations. So inaccessibility and unequal access are actually kind of two different things. There's something that can physically limit you from getting there, and there's also just, for example, if you had a bunch of coffee shops in one area of the city, it's unequal access, but it's still access. So anyways, you can also target areas of highest need. So in really high crime areas in Colorado Springs, you might consider putting a new youth center. So you can map those kinds of things to see where this need exists. And we can also look at spatial segregation and integration, which is still alive and well today, unfortunately. So these links I'm about to bring you to are really cool online websites that integrate GIS mapping with social data. So this first one, I actually want to show you this one. It's a racial density map, and I'm used to using a PC, so excuse me while I try and figure out. I mean, I'm used to using a Mac, so let me figure out how to link this. Where's the go-to link thing?
I would switch over to the PDF and use this.
Oh, did it?
I don't know if it made it.
Oh, it did. Okay. Okay, I didn't think it was me. Sorry. So this is an awesome map that uses 2010 census block data, which, if you think about units of analysis, we have counties, we have states, we have counties, we have census tracts, and then we have census block groups, which are smaller units, and then there's blocks, which are, if you think about it, literally like a city block. And that's generally, using block data, you don't really want to display that on a map, because if you think about it, you get really close to someone's city block. If there's, for example, one Asian person who lives in that building, you could find, it gets too personal, you know what I mean? You can identify people if you display data using only blocks. So they kind of aggregate it out to block groups or census tracts. So this specific map shows the entire United States, and one dot equals one person. And this is really a cool tool when you're first initially exploring something. So what city do you guys want to look at? You said you're from all over the place. You said you were in Michigan, right?
Yep.
Did you ever spend any time in Detroit?
Outside of suburbs.
Okay. Well, this is a
That's
prime example. This is not Detroit, but this is a prime example I like to show of Detroit, because if you think about racial segregation, this is just an alarming example of how it's still here today. If you guys know what the 8 Mile is in Detroit, it used to be a train track. Anyways, it's this really long stretch of road that goes all the way out to the lake. And if you see these two dots, black is green and white is blue, you can see just by a manner of across the road, the demographics there change drastically. And if you know anything about social demographics, you know there's a relationship between minorities and poverty. So you can expect that if we switch this view to not just racial, but also to median household income or 2% impoverished by, you know, these blocks, which this is essentially like a block group here, and a census tract might be a little bigger, but you would still be able to see that drastic difference just by crossing a street. Today it's a street. So this is a really cool tool when if you're looking at specifically racial data, but you can explore these kinds of things, and this is all free and online. Does anyone have any other cities they're interested in? Go to Colorado Springs or Denver. Here's Colorado. You can see as you zoom in, it gets a little more refined. Here's Colorado Springs. I don't even know where we are. See, a lot of these blank spaces actually are things that are parks, for example, or, of course, like Fort Carson, you wouldn't get any of that data publicly. So you have all these interesting little blank spots, but you can see real pockets of diversity here. And then as you zoom out to the suburbs and the distal areas of Colorado Springs, it's very predominantly white. So it's just, these are things you can kind of mess around in and get a lot from what you're trying to explore just by Googling it. And the next one I want to show you is called Social Explorer, and it goes a bit further. So instead of just looking at race, you can look at essentially any sort of demographic data that you can get off the U.S. Census. And this is a really, really cool tool that I just discovered. It maps it for you. So this is population density, but you can go in, see if we wanted to look at Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, we don't have this data on, Canada or anywhere outside, but national data sets are still pretty fun to look at. And as you zoom in, you can change it to do by county, as I was talking about. I don't know what a census place is. I've actually never heard of that. But a census tract or a block group, you can get even more detailed here, and you can change your data to, what do you guys want to look at? Someone shout something out.
Education.
Education. There we go. So, and this is all from the census website. So even if you can't get something on here, you can go to the census website and pull that exact number of this data set off, and you can display it for your own purposes. So we have, so professional edition only. Oh, that's fun. So we can't look at that. I didn't pay money for it. But we can look at, for example, maybe income. Marital status. Oh, look at that. I'm not paying for it. Alright, guys. See if we got unemployment stuff. Well, we can look at that, and I can't tell you why it's not letting me do anything else, because if you don't, well, maybe it's just by census tract. There we go. So here we go. Oh, sorry guys. That was dead. But this, again, is actually a really cool website because you can specify what variables you want in your social research and change it to that and have it displayed spatially. And although you can click on, you know, specific areas and it'll tell you the population density per square mile, for example. And you can use that data, but it's not very good if you're trying to collect massive amounts of data on the city. So it's really good for previewing things and seeing what areas of interest, depending on your variables, are out there. And then you would go into, you know, the U.S. Census Bureau website and get your data from there and clean it up and do all that fun stuff. So sorry that second website didn't work out, but no worries. So next I want to talk about Colorado Springs specifically. So what I did for my thesis last year is I took a look at spatial accessibility of grocery stores, and to really show the integration of both social, looking at access, looking at healthy foods, and specifically food deserts is what I was interested in. And also the spatial is physical access. How do you determine how, you know, whether you live in a food desert or not? What's accessible? So I took this data, it was all U.S. Census data, and I also used Reference USA, which is a really cool website that gets you loads of business data. So I could plot, all these are old grocery stores in Colorado Springs. And again, with GIS, you can run these really complex functions and analyses to assess what accessibility is. So I ran something called a service area analysis. And I set two different maps. One here is drivability, and I set that by 5 to 10 minute driving times. And I thought time was a better proxy for measuring in a car. And so as you can see from this map, if you have a car, you can get to a grocery store essentially within 10 minutes of most places. Now, that said, you have to look at my data to see how you know, the street networks and how well those equations were run to really get the most clear results. But I think it effectively, and anyone who lives in Colorado Springs probably attests that within a reasonable amount of time, if you have a car, you can get to a grocery store, unless you live way up in the hills. And then for my proxy for walking, I did physical distance. So I decided that 1/4 mile, first it was 1/4 to 1/2 mile, and then I realized realistically walking 1/2 mile with all of your groceries is not ideal. And that's kind of where the heart of my thesis came into, was looking at what qualifies as walkable or accessible in terms of people without cars, because that's really what it comes down to. So I made 1/4 mile buffers, and these, you can see they're jagged just like those because they run along street networks. They take into account one-way streets, and they take into account stoplights and timing and all that kind of network analyses to be able to give you a clear picture of realistically, because you can't walk through someone's backyard to get to a grocery store, so it takes that kind of stuff into account. Or you can't cross a freeway, for example. But you can really see that there's not much in terms of accessible walking to a grocery store, and that really calls into question, well, what are your alternatives? Taking the bus, or borrowing a friend's car, if that's a possibility. But the bus systems themselves, they don't want you and all your groceries and all your kids there. So that really got to the heart of what I was looking at, and socially, was what determines access and how can you sort of get around that. So this specifically speaks to this service analysis that I did in GIS, but there's, again, millions of other things you can do. I did a bunch of work for Parks and Recreation, the City of Colorado Springs Parks and Recreation, and I made these maps for their community center down south. This is the Stratton Meadows area, so the Meadows Park Community Center is right here, and it's a really racially diverse area, really economically disadvantaged area. The cops don't go down there. There's no lighting down there. There's potholes. It's just a distressed area. And so I wanted to make these maps with the hopes of starting a discussion around, you know, spatial accessibility and how we can use this kind of information to make change. This I made also was obviously percent impoverished, and we did it by neighborhood. Wade Roberts, you know, did a really nifty aggregation of what he kind of saw were Colorado Springs neighborhoods, and I mean, I thought they were pretty spot on, but it really allows you to see where these pockets of poverty are, and in terms of, as a social researcher, where you would want to focus for mitigating some of those things that people in poverty experience. And then this is essentially the same map, but it's overlaid with the school districts, because as another perspective, you can see that District 11 and mostly Harrison District 2 are really disadvantaged because they have all of those impoverished areas to accommodate for. And I'll show you a map later on that shows FreeReduced Lunch, and you'll really see that as well. So this is median household income, and as you can see, probably to nobody's surprise, where the higher amounts of income are sort of in the distal suburb, foothills areas. This one was cool, educational attainment. I really like dot density maps because you can really see everything at once. This like one dot equals one person is what we call a dot density map. And you can see up here, these are the actual statistics, if that makes it easier. But again, this is really just how GIS allows you to visualize these things that previously are just in a table or on a survey, or things that people talk about, but it's really hard to visualize at times. Or sometimes it's just poorly represented in a map. So this one, as I was talking about earlier, shows school by students receiving free and reduced lunch. So these biggest dots have 68 to 94% of their student body getting free reduced lunch every day. And then I also line that up with unhealthy food retail, so liquor stores and convenience stores, fast food. I made sort of a heat map to show where the highest concentrations, and of course, like any color is going to show a density that you don't want because it's unhealthy food. You don't want to see color, but to really emphasize where the biggest pockets of unhealthy food are really close to all these same areas with lots of kids getting free reduced lunch. Which speaks to, you know, what kind of options they have and what kind of access to healthy resources they have to be able to, well, just to be able to have an even playing field in terms of addressing things such as obesity and other health issues. If there's no grocery store in your neighborhood, you can't do anything about it. So this was my favorite map because, again, looking at accessibility to grocery stores, you look at who doesn't have a car, and vehicle access isn't just do you own a car, it's do you have a friend who owns a car, do you have access to a car reliably at any one time. And for this map specifically, I wanted to, this is the Department of Human Services up here, really absolutely located on the Garden of the Gods Road, which, as you can see from the map, most people who need it are down here. So, and I had a bus map that I didn't put in, but there is a bus line that goes up there. But anyone who's taken the bus systems would know it takes a couple hours to get up there, and then you have to get back, and it's not especially realistic for people to be able to get up there. So this is the kind of thing where if you had a GIS map when they're deciding to put this in, you could probably be like, hey, I don't think that, of all places, is where this needs to go. And that is what I personally hope to do with GIS in the future and this kind of technology, is kind of assess the areas of most need from a social standpoint. And this final map I have here is urban trail accessibility, which speaks to, again, people with no cars. And this specific neighborhood down here, the Meadows Park Community Center, this neighborhood is really not a great neighborhood. And if you're a child and you want to go on a bike ride, for example, you can bike in the neighborhood, But if you wanted to get, or if you're an adult and you wanted to get anywhere, not on the car, you have to cross Highway 24, South Nevada, go up the highway, cross under Highway 25, and then you get to Dorchester Park, and then you get on a trail where you can get essentially anywhere in the city. But it's, you know, the sidewalks are pretty bad, it's two highways, there's a lot of traffic. This is also chock full of Wendy's and fast food and liquor stores, just sort of a depleted area, and something that's really need of restoration and access, physical access for kids to be able to get out of just this one park that they have. So that's the last map I have. Yeah, well, so that kind of covers the social aspects of GIS and what I've done with it, and if this silly website was working a lot better, we can try and look at, you know, places where you guys are from or anything you guys are interested in, because I really want to turn this to people who like maps, people who are interested in spatially analyzing things, because I'm all about it and I like to explore. So if I could get this to work, we can potentially look at some cool things. But does anyone have any questions or any additions or anything?
How hard is it to do this in a historically situated kind of a way? You're looking at spatial analysis. How hard is it to add time as another factor?
It depends. We kind of struggle in GIS because maps are pretty static. I mean, you can zoom and pan and get all this interactive stuff, but it still captures a second in time almost.
Right.
So you could do that if you had data from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, ancient times. If you had that data, and even if it's inputting it yourself, you could, if you had some points and geographic locations, you could display that and have two snapshots, say, then and now. I've worked with students who are trying to go to like 50 million years ago, so the Earth isn't even the same shape, so I've not been able to do that. That's a whole new history time element that is doable and people are working on it, but yeah, it all depends on the data you have. So you could do two snapshots, there's probably some cool interactive features that show change over time, and it's just up to what you can find. So historical data, I mean, I think geographically, like locations of battles or cities, migration patterns you can kind of show with an arrow, but that's a little simple. But that answers your question.
Well, with this, if you have the census data, and it looked like when you were poking through trying to find it, it gave you some years. So with this particular one, it looked like it would at least give you, if you paid to get access, it looks like that does have a range. So
And
if you were doing population in different areas.
Definitely. And also, it always pops up in 2010 because the decennial census, every 10 years, is the most comprehensive. I mean, it's a really extensive. And now, since 2000, I want to say 5 or 6, they started doing the American Community Survey, which is a yearly survey. So you can get yearly data. You can get aggregated yearly data, or it's actually over a span of 5 years. So you can get really great information from 2000 or from 2013. That's not as in depth as 2010, but for a lot of the data most people are looking at, you just want, I don't know, race or income and all the basic kind of stuff can come in the 2013 edition. But you can get a lot more out of 2010, and you're right, and if you pay for it, of course, they'll give you it all. But I was just messing with this in the lab, and it let me do, you know, some stuff.
And it does say U.S. demography 1790 to the present, so I guess theoretically you could go back to this tool to look at, you know, Maryland in 1790 and see what the...
So they've got base population.
Yeah.
Census 1790.
Funky.
Total population. Okay,
Well,
so they
that's
have
partial.
dots here. So that's pretty cool. I guess the West Coast would be really sparsely populated at this point.
Yeah, I guess they probably wouldn't show much in Colorado Springs, eh?
No,
There you go.
Even though I'm sure we did have a population here.
Just not one that was surveyed.
Not one worth the census, I guess.
Well, let's try for 1874.
Yeah, so they have obviously more basic data because they're collecting detectives weren't so great. But if you could make your own table of something you wanted to show,
yeah.
you could absolutely map it. It's just how good the data is.
I mean, that seems like it's possible because I know, like, in England, they started taking the census in the 19th century, I think it was, maybe the end of the 18th century, so they have some of that information.
Yeah,
And it would just be a question of plugging it in, I suppose.
exactly. And sometimes you find that looking at things spatially helps the research process, but the end result, you don't end up using any maps or anything. It just kind of helps with the process and to recognize some patterns.
I like the whole overlap, because a lot of times you'll get,
Right.
you know, it was just interesting where you had each individual map of something, and then you took them and, you know, overlapped them.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes we take things in their own context, but then if you take them and, you know, in a sense, multiply the context,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
then you have them. I like that, that was cool.
Apply all those lenses. Yeah, and there's a big difference between, this was my thesis work, and I had like a series of probably 12 maps, and it was all like white people, black people, Asian people, seniors, all a different map, and now I've learned how to smush them all together and make it all one map. So there's a pretty big difference between the 6 months between this map and that one actually. But yeah, it really allows you to apply all sorts of lenses, economically, socially, environmentally, and be able to put them on top of each other and recognize what's happening all at the same time. But like you said, people just overlook because it's not their expertise. It's not what they think about every day. So. I'm mad at the computer for this, but anyone else have questions? Anyone else want to do GIS now forever and ever? But wait, oh, we have candy. I feel like I should pop quiz you guys.
Yeah, that's totally appropriate. Totally do.
Yeah, but what does GIS stand for? If you guys can answer that. Well, there we go. Okay. G.
Geographic.
Information.
Systems.
Great. That was just for the sake of it.
That was awesome.
Let's see how good you're at this.
There we go.
All right.
Oh, that was a little short.
Oh, one jumper. I can't catch.
Overhand. Oh, baby.
Thank you all for coming to Tech Tuesday. Let's thank Madison for the presentation.